First thing Rail found when it landed was quiet. Not the quiet of a dead world. Dead worlds had their own texture, kind of mineral stillness that the Vorkai had learned to read from orbit. This was something different, something with weight and pulse underneath it, like a thing holding its breath. Rail stood at the rim of its descent crater in the pre-dawn dark and rotated its sensory cluster in a slow arc. The planet's atmosphere hit its chemistry glands with a rush of nitrogen, oxygen, trace methane, breathable in the emergency sense, nauseating in the biological one. The heat was extreme. Its chitinous plates flexed against the warmth radiating up from the cracked, pale earth, and Rail exhaled through 3 of its 5 respiratory vents, since something that had any human been alive to witness it might have looked like relief. It had been a long crossing. The orb, the compact pressurized stasis sphere in which Rail had survived 41 light-years of travel, had hit the desert floor at a velocity that should have been fatal. The sphere's absorption membrane had taken most of it. But the membrane was now breached. Rail crouched over the crumpled silver shell and ran a manipulator arm across the split seam. The internal fluid, a deep amber nutrient solution that the Vorkai required for metabolic regulation, had hemorrhaged into the dry earth and been drunk by it instantly. The soil around the impact site was dark with it, already stiffening as the desert heat reclaimed the moisture. Rail processed this with the cold efficiency of a creature that had been trained. Over the span of a civilization far older than humanity's first word carved into clay to adapt, the orb was ruined. The return beacon inside it was dead. There would be no going home. Not until Rail had solved the immediate problem that its biology was already beginning to scream about. It needed fluid. It needed it badly, and soon and in quantities the parched desert floor could not provide. Raised it and tasted the air again. Somewhere to the west, perhaps 4 kilometers, perhaps 5, biological signatures. Warm, wet, mammalian. At least a dozen of them clustered in a loose arrangement. Some stationary, some moving with the agitated, unpatterned motion the Vorkai's anthropological records classified as social friction. Emotional arousal without violent intent. Rail began walking. The camp had no official name. Claire Taylor called it the program. Bert called it the operation. Roth, who had driven 6 hours through the night to get there, because his uncle had called, and Roth had never in his life been able to say no to his uncle, called it a mistake. He'd arrived just past midnight to find a collection of military surplus tents staked into the pale Utah hardpan, a generator humming beside a single axle trailer, and 6 teenagers sitting in the dirt at various stages of contempt, ranged from sullen to visibly furious, and the one called Trapper, a broad kid with the kind of muscle that came from a gym rather than work, had already managed to kick over a water cask within the first 10 minutes of Roth being there. Claire had righted it without comment, had given Trapper a look that could have cured leather. "They're not bad kids," Bert had said, squeezing Roth's shoulder with a hand the size of a dinner plate. "They're just kids who need somebody to show them something real." Ruth had looked at the 6 of them. Trapper and his crossed arms, Mika sitting apart with her knees drawn up, Luis who hadn't stopped watching the horizon since he got there, Courtney braiding and unbraiding the same rope with the focused intensity of someone choosing not to have a breakdown, Wes who had fallen asleep against his pack before the orientation was finished, and he'd thought, "I am not that somebody." But Bert's hand on his shoulder had weighed about the same as the obligation Roth had been carrying since he was 8 years. Old and Bert had pulled him out of a flooding irrigation ditch and held him up by the collar until the water dropped. So Roth had nodded and said, "I can do real." Dawn came red and violent over the eastern ridge. Roth was up before it, for the generator-powered coffee had finished, standing at the edge of camp with a topographic map and a compass and the particular alertness of a young man who has slept badly on hard ground and knows the day ahead will be longer. Claire appeared beside him with 2 cups. She handed him one without asking whether he wanted it. "I mapped out a 10-kilometer loop," she said. "Takes us through the canyon, up the back ridge, back around by the old mine road. Nothing technical, plenty of shade in the canyon section." "Water?" Ruth asked. 2 liters each, plus the communal casks on the frame pack Bert carries. "We cache the heavy gear at the trailhead and do the loop light." She sipped. It's going to hit 38 today, maybe 40. Ruth looked at the sky. It was the color of old bone, and the sun wasn't fully up yet. Fun, he said. It wasn't for the first 2 hours. Trapper complained. Wes fell behind and had to be waited for. Louise said nothing, but watched the ridgeline with the expression of someone who'd grown up somewhere that had taught him. The ridgeline was where trouble came from. Mika moved well and quiet, and Roth found himself noting that. The economy of her movement, the way she placed her feet without being told, as if she'd done desert walking before. Courtney kept pace with Claire, talking steadily, the way some people talk when silence feels like a trap. Bert moved at the back of the group, with the unhurried bulk of a man who knows his own endurance. He carried the frame pack with the communal water, and didn't complain, even though the pack weighed what a small engine weighed, because Bert Goodman had long ago arrived at an understanding with discomfort that involved accepting it rather than fighting it. They found the orb 2 hours out. Or rather, Luis found it. He'd stepped off the trail to relieve himself behind a formation of sandstone and come back 20 seconds later with his face doing something complicated. "There's a thing," he said, and that was all he said, and something about the way he said it moved the entire group off the trail, without another word being exchanged. Sat in a shallow depression between two rock formations, like a collapsed star, silver-gray, roughly spherical, maybe 1.5 meters in diameter. Though the geometry was disturbed where one side had caved in on itself. The surface was unlike any metal or polymer Roth had ever seen. Not quite reflective, not quite matte, something in between that seemed to change depending on the angle of the light. The ground around it was dark and stiff, as though something wet had soaked into the earth and dried. "Meteorite," Bert said, from a respectable distance. "Meteorites are rock," Claire said. She'd taken out her phone to photograph it, then looked at the screen and said, "No signal, obviously." "It's not rock," Roth said. He crouched at the edge of the depression, keeping 3 feet of air between himself and the object. Close, there was a faint smell. Not unpleasant, almost antiseptic, like the air inside a hospital recycled through something organic. And there were seams in the surface. Deliberate ones. The kind that suggested the object had been built rather than formed. "Don't touch it," he said. Trapper touched it. Of course, Trapper touched it. He shoved past Wes with the casual entitlement of someone who'd never learned that other people's caution might be worth listening to. And he kicked the curved surface with the toe of his boot, hard, and the sound it made was not the dull clang of metal, but something with overtones. A resonance that moved up through the feet and into the sternum, and sat there for a moment vibrating. A crack appeared along one of the seams. Amber fluid ran out of it and hit the hot ground and steamed. For a moment, nothing else happened. Then Lenny's truck came around the bend in the mine road, and everything changed. Except it wasn't Lenny driving it. It wasn't anyone driving it. It had rolled down the dry wash on its own momentum and come to rest against a fan of collapsed shale, and when Bert wrenched the driver's door open, Lenny was inside. What remained of Lenny was inside, a man-shaped arrangement of skin and collapsed tissue that had the color and texture of old paper, and the weight, Roth guessed, of maybe 40 pounds. Like someone had emptied him. Like someone had taken everything wet out of a person and left the rest. Bert stood very still, looking at Lenny. Then he closed the truck door quietly, the way you close doors in hospitals. "Back to camp," he said. Now fast. They didn't make it back to camp. Not all of them. It took Rail 6 minutes to process the biology of its first feeding and understand, with the efficient certainty of a creature evolved for exactly this kind of rapid xenobiological adaptation, these organisms were, and what they contained, and how much of it would be required. The answer to the last question was more. Considerably more. The fluid volumes a single specimen provided were adequate for immediate stabilization, but insufficient for sustained function. Metabolic requirements over the next 72 hours would demand at minimum 8 to 10 full extractions, possibly more depending on how much the physical exertion of hunting cost. Rail was not cruel. The concept in Vorkai cognition existed as a category error, applying an emotional framework to a physiological necessity. Rail needed fluid the way the desert needed heat, was a condition of existence. But Rail was not unintelligent either. The organisms were social, mobile, and now frightened. Fear made prey dangerous in ways that simple flight did not. Rail processed the scent trails radiating from the cluster, the sharp ammonia of adrenaline, the pheromonal signatures of threat response, the way the group's movement patterns had suddenly coalesced from scattered to tight and directional. They were going to run together. Social organisms almost always did. Running together made them easier to track. It also made them harder to separate. Rail considered the tactical implications while its proboscis retracted and its chest plate sealed, and it began moving through the rock formations with the fluid, low-profile gait of a creature that had been hunting on worlds it did not understand for longer than human civilization had existed. It decided to be patient. Patience was a Vorkai virtue that bordered on pathology. The canyon offered shade but not safety, and the distinction mattered. Roth understood this on a level he couldn't entirely articulate, a kind of spatial awareness he'd developed over years of guiding in places where the terrain was the most neutral of possible enemies, not trying to kill you, simply indifferent to whether you lived. The canyon walls rose 40 feet on either side, red and ochre and cut with horizontal striations, beautiful in the objective sense that something inhuman and enormous can be beautiful. But the walls narrowed ahead. One way in, one way out. And the way out was the way they'd come in, and something was behind them on that trail. He didn't say that out loud. He didn't have to. Wheeze had said 20 minutes back. Wes had been last in line, and then Wes hadn't been anywhere. Sans. And the scrub brush beside the trail had been disturbed in a way that Roth couldn't look at directly without his stomach doing something unpleasant. "We go forward," Claire said. She had the frame pack now. Bert had transferred the water casks to her without explanation, and she was standing in the middle of the canyon floor with her hands at her sides, in a posture that Roth recognized as the particular stillness of someone making a decision they know will cost something. "There's a fire road on the other side of this canyon. Lenny's truck is gone, but there might be other traffic. The road's 9 kilometers from here," Roth said. "Then we walk 9 kilometers. In this heat, with what we're carrying." Roth's voice was quiet, not frightened. Something more controlled than frightened, which was in some ways harder to witness. "What's the alternative?" He looked back down the canyon. The shadows between the rock formations had the wrong quality. Too dark, too stable, like something was occupying them that didn't move with the light. "Forward," he said. "Stay close, don't separate, don't go off trail for any reason." Bert said. "I'm not taking orders from." "Trapper," Bert said. Trapper, shut up. It was the quietest Roth had ever heard Bert's voice, and it apparently translated clearly across whatever language Trapper operated in, because he went quiet and stayed quiet, and fell into line like everyone else. They moved. Rail took the aggressive one first, because aggression in prey organisms was a physiological state. Elevated cortisol, accelerated cardiovascular function, heightened muscle oxygenation, and elevated physiological states produced richer fluid. It was not a punishment. It was nutritional logic. It separated him from the group in the long stretch of canyon where the trail curved left and the rock wall on the right offered 3 meters of dead space that Rail had been occupying for 11 minutes, still as cooling stone, its surface chromatophores, cycling through the ochre and red of the surrounding sandstone in patterns so precise that even a trained eye at 5 meters might have missed it. The large male, the aggressive one's older companion, the one who moved with fighter's economy, registered the absence within perhaps 40 seconds. He didn't call out immediately. He turned. He looked. Earl watched him process the disappearance and watched his voice change. The particular compression of the brow and the widening around the eyes, that Vorkai's records tagged as grief fear, the recognition of a specific loss rather than a general threat. The large male made a sound. Low, involuntary. Then he turned back to the group and said something with quiet, controlled urgency, and they moved faster. Good, faster was fine. Rail was not trying to stop them from reaching the road. The road would bring more organisms. More organisms meant more fluid. Patience, reminded from myself, patience. The heat hit 42 degrees by mid-afternoon and the canyon gave up its shade. Roth had been counting water since noon, not obsessively, not in the way that made people spiral, with the steady actuarial focus he'd learned from 3 seasons of desert guiding, the same focus that told him when a group could push and when they couldn't. The math was not good. They had 12 liters between 7 people in conditions that demanded at least a liter per person per hour of hard walking. The road was still 4 kilometers out. The arithmetic arrived at a conclusion that Roth set aside with the deliberateness of a man who has learned. That panic is a faster killer than dehydration. "We stop," he said, when they reached a section of canyon where a rock overhang threw a band of shade, 8 feet wide. 15 minutes, water, no talking. Nobody argued. Even Courtney, who hadn't stopped talking since the morning, went quiet. She sat beside Luis, and he put his arm around her, and they both looked at nothing, in the way of people who are working very hard, not to look at the space where someone used to be. Mika sat near Roth, not conspicuously, not in the way that was about seeking comfort, just positioned. The way you position yourself when you are a situation, and you want to be near the person who seems most likely to respond correctly to it. "You know what it is," she said. Not a question. "No," Ruth said. "But you know it's not an animal." He looked at her. She was 17 at most. Quality of stillness that was unusual in someone her age. The particular composure that comes not from peace, but from having already processed a significant amount of difficulty. "No," he said, "it's not an animal." She nodded once and said nothing else. And Roth found himself, absurdly, in the middle of a canyon in 42-degree heat, with something impossible circling them in the rock. Grateful. For her, Claire had laid the contents of the grain pack out on a flat rock while people rested. Water, emergency rations, a basic first aid kit, 2 emergency flares, a folding knife, a multi-tool, 20 meters of paracord. She arranged these objects with the methodical care of someone who has run operations under resource constraints and knows that the difference between what you have and what you need is a problem you solve with organization. "Flares for the road," she said to Roth, without looking up. "Knife and cord to you, multi-tool to Bert. What about the water? Split it. Equal shares including the kids. We move it around rather than centralizing." She finally looked up. "If we get separated, we don't get separated, Roth, Claire." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she nodded and went back to dividing the water into individual containers with the quiet precision of someone, who has already made the piece she needs to make. Bert came and stood next to Roth, and they looked back down the canyon together, the way men look at things they cannot fully see. "How long do you think it's been watching us?" asked. "Since the orb," Ruth said. "You think it needs something from us. I think it needs something in us." Bert was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Lenny was emptied." "Yeah, completely, yeah." Bert rolled his big shoulders once, slowly, the way a fighter rolls shoulders before a match, not to intimidate, just to confirm to himself that the machinery still works. "All right," he said. "Then we make it difficult." The fire road was a dirt track barely 2 lanes wide, unmaintained, with deep ruts from the last monsoon season and a cable gate at the far end that hadn't been opened since before the drought. It was the most beautiful thing Roth had seen in his life. They reached it as the sun dropped toward the western ridge, bleeding orange across the hardpan, the kind of light that made the desert briefly gorgeous and briefly bearable. 6 of them reached it. They didn't talk about the number 6. Not yet. Bert found the fuel cans in the maintenance shed beside the gate, 3 of them, red plastic, 2 gallons each. Roth doled to the shed door and looked at the cans and looked at Bert. And something passed between them that didn't require language. "Louis," Ruth said. "Courtney, Mika, stay with Claire on the far side of the gate." Mika started to object, looked at her, and she closed her mouth and then opened it again to say, "I want to help." "You will," he said. "I promise, just not yet." Plan was simple in the way that desperate plans tend to be. Not elegant, not sophisticated, just built out of what was available and what was known. What was known, the thing tracked by heat and scent. What was available? 6 gallons of gasoline, 20 meters of paracord, a multi-tool with a wire cutter blade, and 2 flares. What Roth had learned over 3 seasons of desert guiding. Fire in dry country spreads faster than most people understand. Predators, even alien ones, even ones that had been methodically draining human beings of every fluid in their bodies, are not immune to the basic equation that heat requires water to survive. He explained it to Bert in about a minute and a half. Bert listened without interrupting, then said, "It's going to come through that." He gestured at the bottleneck where the road passed between two rock faces close enough that you could reach both walls simultaneously. "Yeah," Roth said. "So we need to make it not want to come through, or make it regret it." Its expression did the thing it did when he was running the math on something physical. A brief, private calculation that happened somewhere behind his eyes. "Okay," he said. "Show me where you want the cord." Rael had been patient. Patience was a Vorkai virtue that bordered on pathology, but it had boundaries. Rael's fluid reserves were now critically low. The long pursuit through the canyon had cost more than the intake from 3 extractions had provided. A metabolic deficit that was beginning to manifest as tremor in the distal manipulator limbs and a dimming in the peripheral sensory array that Rael recognized as early depletion crisis. It needed to complete the extraction cycle within the next 2 to 3 hours or face systemic shutdown. Prey cluster had reached the flat track that its topographic sensory mapping identified as a maintained transit route. They had clustered at a narrows between 2 rock faces, and Rael had observed them with the careful attention of a hunter who knows that prey behavior in the final moments of flight is often different from prey behavior throughout the pursuit. They were doing something with a chemical compound that Rael's atmospheric sensors identified as a long-chain hydrocarbon, fuel. They were distributing it across the surfaces of the narrows. Rael processed this. A threat display, perhaps, or an attempt at a barrier. It moved toward the narrows. The thin line of cord, across the entrance at ankle height, was not visible in the long shadows of sunset. Rael's lower limbs hit it at full stride. The trigger attached to the cord's far end was not complicated. A bent pin holding a striker against a flare cap. The kind of mechanism that Roth had built out of the multi-tool and 15 minutes of focused, handshaking work. It was the kind of mechanism that should not have worked on the first try. It worked on the first try. The flare ignited at the base of the fuel-soaked rock face on the left side of the narrows, and the gasoline went up with a sound like an enormous exhaled breath, and the wall of the narrows became a wall of fire that stretched 8 feet high and filled the passage with a heat that the Utah desert, even at 42 degrees, even in August, could not have prepared anything for. Rael did not experience pain in the way that biological organisms with nociceptors experience it. Rael experienced what happened next as a cascade of system alarms that filled its sensory array with the equivalent of screaming. The fire stripped moisture from its outer chitinous plates faster than the internal redistribution systems could compensate. The heat pushed into the respiratory vents and triggered emergency closure. Its manipulator arms, already tremoring from depletion, went rigid, fell. The fall was not dramatic. It was simply the cessation of a series of processes that had, until that moment, been a sustaining vertical movement. Bert came around the left side of the narrows, with a section of steel fence post he had pulled from the ground, near the maintenance shed. He was the only person on the planet who was not afraid of what was lying in the dirt. Or rather, he was afraid, because Bert Goodman was not stupid, and what was lying in the dirt was 10 feet long, and built from nightmare materials and had killed 3 people he cared about. But the fear had been organized, filed somewhere that didn't interfere with what needed to happen. He hit it 4 times. The 4th time, the central carapace gave. The amber fluid that ran out was darker than what had soaked into the desert floor by the orb. Almost brown, almost empty. Bert stood over it for a long moment. Then he set down the fence post and sat on a rock and put his face in his hands. Not in grief. Not yet. Grief would come later, in the specific and permanent form of 3 names that would need to be carried forward, but in the private collapse that follows the end of sustained effort. The moment when the body says, "We're done. The machinery can stop now," came around from the right side of the narrows. He looked at the thing in the dirt. He looked at Bert. "Is it?" he started. "Yeah," Bert said, to his hands. "It's done." The moon came up enormous and white the way desert moons do, inflated by the flat horizon. So bright you could read by it, if you had anything left in you worth reading. Ruth sat against the maintenance shed wall, with Claire on one side and Mika on the other. And Luis was asleep with his head on Courtney's shoulder, and Courtney was awake, and looking at the stars with an expression that had stopped being anything simple. The road was 4 miles from the nearest cellular signal. In the morning, they would walk it. For now, they sat in the moonlight and drank the rest of the water slowly, rationing it, not because they needed to anymore, but because the habit of care was still running. "The camp's gone," Claire said at one point. Not as a lament, as a fact put on the table so it could be looked at. "Yeah," Ruth said. "Figure out something else." "Yeah." She was quiet for a while, then, "You know what I keep thinking about?" "What?" "It came all the way here. 40 light years, whatever. However long that takes. All that way." She looked at the sky, at the scatter of stars in the dark west. "And it needed us for the same thing we need the water." Roth looked at the sky too. The thought settled in him. Not lightly, not comfortably, with the specific weight of a true thing. "Yeah," he said. "We're a resource to something out there. We were tonight." He shifted against the shed wall. "Tonight we were also something else." She didn't ask what. He wouldn't have had a simple answer anyway. And the night was not the place for complicated ones. But he thought about Bert sitting on the rock, with his face in his hands after it was done. About Mika placing her feet with precision on a trail she'd never walked. Reading the desert without being taught. About Luis watching ridgelines with an inherited alertness that turned out to be useful after all. About Courtney, talking through her fear instead of around it, turning language into a tool for survival. About the way humans, when they are cornered and frightened and running low on everything that keeps them upright, build things out of cord and gasoline and a bent pin, and the things they build work. Mika, sitting close beside him, said, "Do you think there are more of them?" Ruth considered this for a long time. The honest answer was yes. The statistical answer, given how large space was and how long civilization had presumably been evolving out there, obviously yes. "Probably," he said. "So this happens again." "Probably." She was quiet then, in a voice that was neither frightened nor brave, but something more solid than either. "Okay, just that. Okay." The words sitting on the desert air like a stone set down in exactly the right place. Roth looked at her sideways in the moonlight. This 17-year-old girl, who'd been sent to a wilderness boot camp, because somewhere along the way someone had decided she was a problem to be protected, and who had moved through a day of impossible things with the quiet economy of someone who had been preparing for impossible things, without knowing it. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." Bert came and lowered himself to the ground beside them, with the careful deliberateness of a very large, very tired man. And he sat with his back against the shed wall and his forearms on his knees, and he looked at the moon for a while. "Lenny had a sister in Moab," he said. "I know," Claire said. "I'll call her in the morning." "I know." They sat with that for a while. The generator inside the shed, Sid, had run out of fuel hours ago, and there was no light except the moon and the stars, and the desert was doing what the desert does at night, cooling slowly, reluctantly, releasing the day's heat in long, slow radiations that rose against the skin like breath. Somewhere out in the dark, something clicked and settled. His hand moved to the knife at his hip before he'd consciously decided to. Nothing happened. The clicking stopped. A cactus wren, probably, adjusting to the temperature change. Probably. He left his hand on the knife anyway. Luis stirred awake, looked at the sky, said, "What time is it?" And when nobody answered, went back to sleep. Courtney tucked her head against his and closed her eyes. Roth stayed awake, did the thing he'd been doing since he was 22, and first started guiding in country that didn't forgive inattention. He cataloged the sounds and sorted them, the known from the unknown, the expected from the anomalous, mapping the desert the way you map any territory you're responsible for, not by conquering it, but by learning its habits. By learning what it sounds like when nothing is wrong, because the knowing was everything. The knowing was what Rael, tumbling out of 40 light years of darkness in a pressurized sphere, emerging into an alien desert with an alien thirst and the cold certainty of a superior organism, had not accounted for. Not the knife or the fuel or the flare and the bent pin. Those were just tools. What mattered was the knowing. That Roth had been reading this desert for 3 seasons. That Bert had been managing physical threat for 30 years. That Mika had been moving through hostile environments since before anyone thought to write it on her file. That Luis watched ridgelines. That Courtney talked her fear into something she could use. The knowing had weight. The knowing, accumulated and distributed across a group of organisms that had spent a very long time on a planet that tried, in countless small and large ways, kill them every day. The knowing had weight that nothing 40 light-years away could have anticipated. Ruth leaned his head back against the shed wall and looked at the stars. They were beautiful. They'd always been beautiful. He'd been looking at them his whole life from desert floors just like this one, and they'd always suggested something. Some enormity out there that humankind was not the center of. He'd made a kind of peace with that for the years. The peace that came from understanding that your smallness in the universe did not reduce your significance on the ground beneath you. Something enormous was out there, looking in. Plenty of it, probably. With various hungers and various ideas about what the third planet from this particular star had to offer. Let them come and find out, he thought. Just let them come and find out what we do with cord and gasoline and time enough to think. He closed his eyes. He listened to the desert breathe. He waited for the morning. In the morning they walked.